Welcome back to Inclusive Design 24 2019, brought to you in partnership with our Gold supporters, Barclays Access and Intopia. Don't forget you can subscribe to Inclusive Design 24 on YouTube by visiting youtube.com/Inclusive Design 24 and hitting the subscribe button. You can also follow ID24Conf on Twitter, and if you have questions for the presenters, tweet them using the ID24 hashtag and we'll ask them at the end of the session. A reminder that ID24 is a respectful community with a code of conduct available at available on our website.
And we have a couple of ID24 local events. So we'll say hello to everyone joining us live from Lincoln, Nebraska, USA, at the Nebraska Digital Accessibility Meetup, and also from Miami U and Miami University, Ohio. So next up, we have Sarah Luthwaite, who will be speaking on the subject of teaching accessibility and 10 messages from research. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. I'm Sarah Luthwaite. I'm joining you from the University of Southampton on the sunny coast of the UK. And I'm delighted to be here with you and hope this talk gives you some food for thought. So I'm going to talk today about the teaching of accessibility. And specifically, I'm going to introduce you to 10 messages from educational research that I think will resonate with you, whether you're working in accessibility training, professional development, or seeking to upskill your clients or your peers in the teams you work with. But first, a little bit about me. I'm an educational researcher. I have a PhD in learning sciences, and I've worked in disability, accessibility, and learning technologies for quite a long time. I'm currently principal investigator on a new 4-year research project on the teaching of accessibility here at the Centre for Research and Inclusion in Southampton's Education Department. I'm currently in the process of building a team to research how accessibility can be effectively taught at universities and in the workplace using innovative video and digital methods. And we're also undertaking a large-scale systematic literature review into existing research on the teaching of accessibility. My work's funded by a major grant from UKRI, that's UK Research and Innovation, which is the umbrella organisation for the UK government's research councils. Importantly, our project is using collaborative methods to create learning networks through the research process. And as such, we're committed to open science principles and open access publishing. And we're looking to forge new collaborations and dialogue between academia and industry. So I'm delighted to be here talking to you. And if you're interested in our work, please do check out the website, which can be found at teachingaccessibility.ac.uk. That's where we're going to be sharing video, resources, papers, and so forth as our work and thinking develops. You'll already find a library of papers on the teaching of accessibility on the website, as well as video from my recent presentation about that literature from the London Accessibility Meetup last month. We'll be adding more on our methods, which you can see an outline of here, over the next few weeks and months, as well as calls for research, collaboration, and so on. So today, I'm here to try and bridge from education research to accessibility and bring these two fields of research into dialogue. I'm assuming you already know about accessibility, so I'm focusing on education. I'm going to introduce 10 evidence-informed principles for effective teaching and learning that are drawn from a major 10-year UK study that has synthesized a vast amount of empirical educational research. In part one, I'm going to set the scene, give you some background as well as some useful terms, as well as briefly outlining some of the key pedagogical challenges in this field that I think many of you will recognize. Please do note this is a talk about educational research and principles that we can apply to the teaching of accessibility. I'm not talking about the current accessibility teaching literature or more generally how to teach in an accessible way, although obviously this is highly relevant for us as educators. So over the next half hour, I'm hoping I can give you some interesting things to reflect on, no matter what your background, to maybe expand your educational repertoire using evidence-informed approaches, so you can more easily reflect on what you do and effectively share accessibility as an educator or an advocate with your colleagues, teams, and wider audiences. So, part one, the evidence. So, where do these evidence-based principles for teaching come from? What is the evidence? That's a good question. So these principles come from the catchily titled Teaching and Learning Research Programme, or TLRP for short. To date, this has been the UK's largest educational research investment, representing millions of pounds in research funding between 2000 and 2011. Some of you might recall the mantra at that time was, quote unquote, education, education, education. And the Labour government were serious about this commitment. In addition to programmes like Building Schools for the Future, TLRP employed over 700 researchers on 70 major projects that looked at everything from early years education right through to higher education and workplace learning. The results included a significant piece of work, which was about synthesizing this research to identify 10 principles for effective pedagogy. And I'll publish all the links to resources and so forth on Twitter and on our website after this talk. The research leaders wanted to be able to provide teachers with some clear research-based principles to improve classroom practice. I'm going to try and translate using examples from accessibility, based in part on previous thinking I've done with Professor Melanie Nind here at Southampton. And so before I begin, I think it's useful to take a moment to think about what pedagogy is. Okay, so pedagogy, or pedagogy, describes the method, theory, and practice of teaching and learning, but it isn't a catch-all term, it is specific. We use it a lot in education because pedagogy explicitly connects teaching and learning. In short, teaching must always be considered together with an understanding of how learners learn. So this really underlines that education isn't something that you do to someone, it's an interaction. And thinking about pedagogy is important. And I think particularly important for us in accessibility, because teaching accessibility requires quite a unique mix of factors. I conceptualize these in sort of three separate areas. It requires a unique mix of conceptual understanding, procedural knowledge, and technical competence. So conceptual understanding in this setting might be around models of disability and capability that touches on various disciplines. Procedural knowledge may be to do with workflows, expert decision-making practices, and as with other fields, expertise may be characterized by a confidence dealing with uncertainty, particularly where we're making really cutting-edge knowledge, and knowledge is new and therefore uncertain. And it also, of course, requires technical skills, the techniques and coding competencies that other speakers have been talking about. And I think when we look at the Inclusive Design 24 kind of set of talks, you can see different talks playing to different areas within this mix. So this is potentially challenging. And alongside this, there are additional pedagogic challenges. These represent and reflect the rapidly changing technological context, which always needs updating. It also relates to disability, which itself is a diverse category that can be conceived of in multiple ways, and where understanding is also growing. There's also a lack of formal curriculum and struggles for visibility beyond a subgroup of human-computer interaction. So a lot of people self-teach, and this might be reliant on online resources and guidance that can prescribe quite limited pedagogic practices. There can also be a gravitation towards establishing best practice, which again may limit teaching and learning approaches when it's not anchored in like a secure research base. And I think we have to be wary of one size fits all training that doesn't bear out the inclusive values that we all ascribe to as accessibility professionals. So additionally, in all fields, educators often start out using the model of how they were taught as they begin teaching. You know, we teach how we were taught, at least initially. And for those who haven't been taught about accessibility in formal education, there's no easy model to follow. And this can be a challenge for a first generation of accessibility teachers. And there's also this issue around pedagogic content knowledge. Pedagogic content knowledge will be familiar to those of you who are educators in formal education. It's a concept defined by Shulman in 1986. It describes the kind of sweet spot between teaching knowledge, that is the pedagogy, and content knowledge, which is about the subject expertise. So in short, it identifies the specific teaching and learning approaches that are needed for a specific subject. So in cutting edge domains like accessibility, experts are often required to teach because they are experts in accessibility in that cutting edge domain, but they may not come from educational backgrounds. So in this way, they might be strong in content knowledge, that is accessibility, but lack pedagogic knowledge. That's a rich teaching repertoire that can be applied to accessibility. So pedagogy, this is not a problem that's unique to accessibility, because I think for many cutting edge domains, as I said, subject expertise does not necessarily go hand in hand with educational expertise. As a result, teachers may be reliant on expertise that's built up over years of trial and error, or the kind of folk pedagogies, that is implicit, unnamed ways of doing that are sort of anecdotally work, but may not have been tested or evaluated. And when expertise are built, they're not necessarily shared because there isn't necessarily the forums to share that teaching expertise, which is going to be a theme of this talk. But on the other side, there's the other challenge of pedagogic content knowledge. From a faculty perspective, that is in universities and other teaching institutes, where there may be teaching knowledge, there can be a lack of content knowledge. So fairly recently at Rochester Institute of Technology, RIT, Shinohara et al. Surveyed 352 institutions on their teaching of accessibility. And they state, quote unquote, the most critical barriers to teaching accessibility that faculty reported were the absence of clear and discipline-specific accessibility learning objectives, and the lack of faculty knowledge about accessibility. Faculty desired resources that were specific to the areas of computing in which they teach, rather than general accessibility resources and guidelines. So that's just a brief outline of some of the challenges from industry side and some of the challenges from an educational side. And bridging these different fields is really important. So let's try and get to these evidence-based principles and see if they resonate with you in your own work. Taking a sip of water. Okay, so I'm going to introduce each principle and try and illustrate each one. But remember, these principles are written in teacher language, so they may take some digesting, written by educational researchers for teachers. But let's see what we can glean from them. And a quick aside here, this is a 40-minute talk. We're 10 minutes in, so I've got less than 3 minutes per principle. If you're watching live, this might be quite intense. However, if you're joining after the event to watch online, do consider pausing the video at each principle and taking time to think about it, how it resonates with what you're doing, your learning journey, and what you plan to do next in your teaching and training. So let's get started. Right, principle 1, effective pedagogy equips learners for life in its broadest sense. Right, we're in at the deep end here, but this is the first principle for a reason. When you're teaching or training or educating, are you giving the learner something that is going to speak to their life? This goes beyond skills and competence and understanding. It's more about those deeper dispositions towards knowledge. In accessibility terms, I think this immediately pushes us to get beyond a quote unquote what works frame of mind and to instead consider what the TLRP team identify as the intellectual, personal, and social resources that will enable your learners to participate as active citizens in the accessibility community. There are many ways this principle can play out, so I'm just going to discuss one aspect. I think for accessibility, one key example might be about awareness raising and promoting deep thinking about what disability is. Disability is a diverse category and it can be conceived in multiple ways. For example, many accessibility specialists use the social model of disability that emphasizes the societal and physical barriers that render a person with impairments as quote unquote disabled. The newcomers to accessibility who view disability in a very medical, tragic, individualistic, or other deficit terms, a revolution in thinking may be necessary to fully recognize how inaccessible tools or services cause experiences, how they actually cause experiences of disability online and what the consequences of that can be. For this reason, many teachers and learning resources aim to expand notions of what disability is from the outset. So one example here is Microsoft's resources highlighting situational and temporary impairments alongside permanent impairments to blur the lines between disabled and non-disabled and place an emphasis on context as a defining factor. Others might use statistics to deconstruct notions of average or to fact check audience preconceptions. Earlier today, Joe Fracchetti talked about perfectionism, imposter syndrome, and anxiety in an earlier presentation here at ID24. And her messages are both highly relevant to digital accessibility, but also to life as we lead it. So these are examples of how learning about accessibility can actually inform somebody's worldview, in inverted commas, equipping them for life in its broadest sense. I'm not telling you to do this one thing one way. I'm trying to highlight the deeper dispositions and the varied ways of knowing that accessibility education can provoke. And this is just principle one. Right, we'll get on to the next. Principle two, effective pedagogy engages with valued forms of knowledge. So this is about giving your audience or learners a sense of what is important within accessibility. Again, you'll see many speakers who've been talking today handling these issues, these values in very adept ways. So questions are, what are the big ideas? What are the key skills and processes? What does quality look like? What are the necessary attitudes and relationships that learners need to understand? What are these expert practices and how do they vary in different contexts? All of these valued forms of knowledge, these don't all have to be conveyed in an instant, but as a teacher, you're trying to share with learners what this accessibility community, this community of practice, values. So here's one example. I think a great example comes from an expert tutorial on making accessibility a core design principle, delivered and written up by one of our hosts, Leonie Watson. She quotes Bruce Lawson, who says, "You'll never be perfectly accessible to everyone, but that's no reason not to strive better. And Leonie herself puts this very eloquently as well. Accessibility doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be a little bit better than yesterday. Both of these statements emphasize values, specifically the value of persistence in the face of uncertainty and a growth mindset over and above a compliance or non-compliance tick box style approach. These statements, I think, artfully expose key accessibility values and real-world complexity. Right, so here's principle 3. Effective pedagogy recognizes the importance of prior experience and learning. So if you want to teach peers or audiences and so on, and for it to really stick and to take people further in their learning at speed, you need to build on what they already know. Evidence indicates that we should take account of what learners know so that they and we can plan their next steps to build on prior learning. And prior learning, I should mention, it includes personal and cultural experiences. Time spent finding out about participants and an audience, finding out about learners or an audience is time really well spent. For example, you'll often see this in talks where a speaker asks the audience for a show of hands or makes a poll on a technical point or on job titles or on developers' backgrounds to check understanding. This allows you to quickly locate your audience, to drop or add content, to pitch difficulty and so on. You probably already do this, so it's good to think about why and other ways to expand your understanding about the people you're talking to. Importantly, this principle recognizes that learning is not atomistic. It's not about this one moment. We're instead trying to focus on any accessibility conversation as being part of a long-term learning journey. It also allows a teacher to draw on learning on learners as a teaching resource. If you have experts in your audience, in your class, in your team, it's so important to bring their knowledge into the mix so all can benefit. And this can be really powerful for learning. So, principle 4. Effective pedagogy requires learning to be scaffolded. Scaffolding is a common term in education, perhaps surprisingly. And let me unpack it a little for you. Evidence about how to teach tells us we need to, quote, provide activities, cultures, and structures of intellectual, social, and emotional support to help learners move forward in their learning. And this support is called scaffolding. The concept of scaffolding or scaffolded learning relates to temporary support or interactions with a more knowledgeable or experienced other. And there's a lot of learning theory in the background here. I might, again, put some links up if you're interested in following this. In accessibility specifically, scaffolding to support learning might mean introducing all kinds of supports or props that they can then be removed when they become unnecessary and learners become more independent. In class, it can be as simple as making a learning task interesting, simplifying aspects of a task, or stressing certain elements, recognizing where difficulty is coming up and helping students cross that threshold conceptually. It might include drawing useful parallels, demonstrating or encouraging. The use of demos, think aloud, live coding, walkthroughs, and so on. These all show ways of doing accessibility, modeling practices in ways that are supportive. Other actions can include providing time for learners to talk to each other, to consolidate their understanding, supplying online resources to support face-to-face teaching or vice versa, or the use of hands-on activities to rehearse skills. And excellent examples of this are accessibility hackathons, those design sprints for inclusion, and other kinds of experiential learning. And I should say, I think that this principle also really highlights the power of mentoring and the importance of mentors in our field. Principle 5, effective pedagogy needs assessment to be congruent with learning. This principle encourages us to think about how assessment can advance learning. Teachers and learners in HCI and other formal contexts where accreditation is at stake will have already given this deep thought. In formal contexts, meaningful assessment is hugely important to ensure that learning doesn't become so abstract it becomes useless. There's also a key issue here around motivation, and that if assessment is congruent with learning, learners are more motivated in their classes. In accessibility, this is why we have hands-on active learning, and problem-based and project-based learning can be key. I've already mentioned hackathons and sprints that use these approaches. In informal learning settings, where digital products may be assessed against standards such as web content accessibility guidelines, WCAG, pedagogy and teaching may start to gravitate around standards and compliance as proxies for accessibility assessment. So it's important for us to recognize that learning is directed to certain outcomes, but what could be other modes by which we judge the success of our learning? And in their work on learning to think like an expert, Ray and Wallace suggest experimenting with diagnostic self-assessment. This is to get learners to think about themselves and make the best connections between their learning needs and any given training opportunity. So you may want to get your learners to be explicit about their competencies and what they can get from training and other education. Principle 6, effective pedagogy promotes the active engagement of the learner. This principle is about learner autonomy and independence. How do we promote independent learning, and how can this be achieved? Learners can be engaged through active learning approaches, be they problem-based tasks, practice and hands-on activities. Promoting active engagement is done to develop, quote unquote, positive learning dispositions. The idea being that learners will take charge of their learning and continue to develop their skills and understanding beyond one course or one event. Hands-on learning may range from highly simulated tasks to authentic experiential learning. And a current example is the Accessibility Internet Rally, currently run by Knowbility. Anything that engages a learner, that gets them to act and contribute and inspires them to take charge of their learning going forward. That's what we're looking for when we talk about active engagement with our learners. Principle 7. Effective pedagogy fosters both individual and social processes and outcomes. I feel this one is quite opaque and a bit difficult to get to grips with, so let's unpack it a little bit. To explain, the authors state, learners should be encouraged and helped to build relationships and communicate with others for learning purposes. And this is done to assist, quote, the mutual construction of knowledge. This principle is really highlighting that learning doesn't happen in a social vacuum. It recognizes that effective pedagogy is about more than individuals. It's about social learning too, and learning communities. In the case of accessibility, social processes are arguably forefronted in industry, where an accessibility specialist may be required to work in cross-functional teams, to upskill peers and advocate for accessibility. But I wonder if accessibility education in universities prepares students to take up these kinds of team roles and the advocacy and arguably teaching or educational roles that these consist of. This principle reminds us not to leave the social aspects of learning to chance, and to instead build in mechanisms that optimize the impact of our teaching by enabling group learning and group support. Examples include time given to group discussion, requiring learners to communicate their work and collaborating in teams on tasks and challenges. And in formal learning situations, there's often good time given to networking, and how that networking is structured can really have an impact on these social learning spaces. Principle 8. Pedagogy recognizes the significance of informal learning. So evidence shows the importance of learning outside the formal context of face-to-face or online course, degree programs, and so on. And it shows the value of using informal learning within more formal contexts. The principle is about recognizing the enrichment value of everyday experience and implies that we need to build connections between formal and informal learning contexts. In your teaching, this can mean asking people to bring their own experiences and understanding of their own personal contexts to the classroom or workshop. And so here's an example of some of the formal contexts I'm talking about. Undergraduate, postgraduate curriculum, maybe the IAAP certification and so forth. And informal learning is strong in our field. Hang on a second. If you just bear with me, I'm aware I've got Skype is coming up in the background, and I'm just going to switch that off. Okay, I'm going back to my slides. Thank you for bearing with me, everybody. My apologies. I'm afraid for some reason I've got a Skype interfering in the background. And I don't appear to be able to switch the alerts off. Right, I'm just going to have to carry on. Okay, I'm going to restart the video.
Sarah, if it's any consolation, we can't see Skype.
Ah, right, great. That's good to know. Okay, right, I shall continue. Apologies. Okay, so moving on to principle 9. Effective pedagogy depends on the learning of all those who support the learning of others. So as teachers or trainers, educators and advocates in a particularly dynamic field, we need to learn continuously. Ongoing professional development is essential, as is the culture and community that supports this. And recognizing ourselves as learners helps us to support others and develop knowledge and skills, as well as adapt to new accessibility challenges more effectively as teachers and learners. Inquiry into our own practices in terms of accessibility and pedagogy warrants support. Evidence shows there are clear benefits in creating learning communities for educators. For accessibility then, it's great that some major accessibility conferences like Inclusive Design 24 and Assets, the ACM International Conference on Computers and Accessibility, which starts later this month on the 28th of October, are open to educational talks and research submissions. Questions, however, remain as to how we scale this as a community. How do we support each other in learning about accessibility and learning about the teaching of accessibility? Principle 10. Effective pedagogy demands consistent policy frameworks with support for learning as their primary focus. This final principle relates to systematic support and the need to create effective learning environments. My pedagogical research has explicit goals to build on the emergent pedagogic culture around accessibility. But we also need trainers, educators, and policymakers to contribute to this culture by helping to develop frameworks for education and professional development that support learning. There is increasing scoping activity in this area. For example, on Tuesday this week, on the 8th of October 2019, the Institute of Accessibility Professionals published a white paper that highlights the importance of accessibility policy and how widely training and learning resources are required. And I'll post the link to on my Twitter after the event. But what do the policies for training and maintaining accessibility skills across your organisation look like? Do they support learning as a primary focus? Is there a policy? This organisational level is required for successful learning and teaching. Knowledge and resources are needed, and this has to be delivered through educational training that recognises that accessibility is not a one-off learning objective. I mentioned the learning journey earlier, and as the field changes, we know education has to keep up. It's likely that pedagogy will iterate in new ways as the technologies we deal with change and as our understandings of disability and ageing change. So attention to organisational approaches to accessibility is going to be more and more important. Without robust frameworks, we can't get the return on investment and expected outcomes that we often anticipate. And educational research is there to back this up. So, next steps. I've covered the principles that I'd like you to consider. There's no one instance of teaching, I must say, that can or should hit all 10 principles simultaneously. But you will see and will have seen that the principles overlap in different ways. And reflecting, I hope, should help you with your inquiry into your own teaching practice. So now I'm going to think a little bit about the future. I think there's a real need for us to build community level discussions about teaching and learning and accessibility. And we need a step change so our learning communities can also begin to identify as teaching communities to effectively scale and share accessibility expertise. For us in academia, I think it's important that we connect disciplines and share research and practice on teaching. Accessibility is taught in various ways in different spaces, from human-computer interaction to web design, but it could also use and better borrow and steal from pedagogic approaches from other spaces. For example, disability studies, library sciences, where accessibility has been a huge theme for many years, and inclusive design more broadly. I'm sure there are other areas that we can draw upon as well. I'd love to see more diverse research and teaching spaces, as well as additional reflective and cross-case research. The research literature on accessibility education is growing, and I encourage you to check it out. So lastly, I'm really interested in how we can all better document and share effective teaching methods. And I have questions for you that I'm really keen you get in touch with in response to if you found this talk useful or are interested in taking things forward. My questions to you are, do these principles resonate with you and your teaching and learning? Have they expanded your thinking on this area? Could these principles be better translated and illustrated for accessibility audiences? Do you want to collaborate on this or something else? And if so, please do get in touch. So I'd just like to say thank you very much for sticking with me through this talk. I hope you found some of it useful. Apologies for the minor technical glitch. And once again, I'd like to thank the Inclusive Design 24 team once again for this opportunity to talk to you and all the amazing work they do behind the scenes. So yeah, I'd like to open up for questions now.
Thank you
Thanks
so
a-
much for that.
Sorry.
So go ahead, David.
Thank you, Sarah. Great talk.
Thank you.
So congratulations again on your fellowship. It sounds like a really great opportunity.
Yeah, no, I'm really looking forward to taking that
what comes
forward.
out. Yeah. You've had plenty of likes and mentions on Twitter, which is great to see. One person suddenly couldn't hear us, but hopefully they've sorted the problem. No actual questions as of yet. People still mulling things over.
There's a lot to mull.
I do have one of my own. So although I'd say things are definitely improving, there's often a bit of a disconnect between industry and academia when it comes to accessibility.
Yes.
And I've noticed this myself, moving from academia to industry. Where do you think this comes from? And how can we sort of better bridge the gap, really, from both directions, I guess?
I think it is tricky because universities have traditionally been beholden only unto themselves, and in terms of the agendas that professors and lecturers encounter, which say we have to deal more closely with industry and give our graduates skills for the future and so on. There's often a lot of tinkering with education from policymakers that leads educators to be quite reticent about doing what they may deem to be industry work for industry. So the question about more vocational skills or skills for industry can be quite a fraught one. It's one that if I was at a lecture theatre, I would sort of throw it open to the floor, because I don't think I have a sort of a clear and definite answer. But what I think I find really encouraging is the extent to which parties on all sides in terms of accessibility, that is the people who teach accessibility and the people who work in accessibility, I think have a real generosity of spirit, which means that the potential for us to work more effectively together is really strong. I mean, in the UK, we have had some great collaborations and some really good projects which have informed, have communicated research and industry understanding back and forth. The funding landscape sometimes changes, and then those resources and connections can be lost, which is frustrating. So the major question in some respects is not just how to get the communications started, but how to sustain it outside of individuals working to do amazing things, or initiatives that then change or shift or ultimately are no longer funded. And as I say, I think some of the initiatives, for example, like Teach Access in the US and so on, which give people opportunities to come together in these kinds of forums, are really powerful. But yeah, it's a challenge. So I welcome any thoughts on how we do this, especially as I've got to do this. So
on a similar note, really, like one sort of criticism that is often made of accessibility education, and you covered this in your talk, is that it's such a rapidly updating topic, a fast-moving target.
Yeah.
Very difficult for educators to keep their content knowledge up to date. I mean, it's hard enough accessibility professionals working in the field. So,
yeah.
So how can educators stay on top of things? Is that active learning and the more informal learning key to that? So I don't know, like shifting the responsibility, broader than that.
Yeah, I think that relates to this point about supporting educators, I suppose. But what might be interesting is the sense in which educators may have to draw on resources from outside the academy. So a lot of universities will have teacher training, or they'll give time to professional development and so on. But how you spend that time, the sort of the reward and so forth for academic performance is sometimes very different to the reward for the relevancy of teaching content. So there is an issue there. I think when I talk about pedagogic culture growing, that would help. And that might come down to things like sharing curriculum, sharing content, as people are starting to develop modules or lectures on particular areas or subjects, rolling those into our teaching, or connecting links across. So for example, I imagine there'll be quite a lot of students who stumble across or come to Inclusive Design 24. Educators might. You can, I think no teacher should expect to know everything about a subject. And this is where sort of drawing student expertise and student engagement in can be really powerful. Because if you can get students to tell you where the cutting edge is in their work, then you gain from them, and then you can reflect that back and use that knowledge as you teach. So sometimes people talk about teaching as if it's like a one unidirectional mode where we just spout knowledge from on high, but it really isn't. The sort of feedback loop of mutual learning with teachers and students, I think that's sometimes a really strong way to come at it, so that your projects are, if you're using project-based learning, open enough for students to do really new and interesting things, and that you can then learn with them within a kind of educational framework. Yeah,
excellent. Okay, and we've just got a question come in on Twitter, actually. I don't know if it's one you'll have an answer for, but it says, how do we get people to stop hating the word pedagogy? In our organisation, it's been weaponised to throw out courses more than 3 years old. Lydia shook.
I mean, I've said this before, but pedagogy is one of those words, I can say like red lorry, yellow lorry. I just spit it out without thinking about it. I mean, it's curious because there are a lot of different sort of the pedagogical terminology is potentially difficult and can be used by other disciplines in very strange ways. So active learning, I've just noticed, has been taken up by artificial intelligence as a mode of sort of machine learning, which is entirely separate from the educational concept of active learning. So the sort of battles over some of these terms, but where I think the terminology is useful is that it allows us to share our practice more effectively. So I think it is worth investing time in just building your educational vocabulary just a little, bit by bit. It doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to be a little bit better than yesterday. If you can gain more vocabulary, then you can share and deepen teaching practices more quickly and more easily. So I hope it's not too much of a dirty word in your organisation. Maybe you need to reclaim that word, and I wish you a lot of luck doing it.
Excellent. Okay, thank you very much. So I'll pass back to Ian.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. That was fantastic. If you liked this session, hit that YouTube like button, and don't forget you can subscribe to youtube.com/inclusivedesign for future notifications. Inclusive Design 24 is brought to you with thanks to our gold supporters, Barclays Access and Intopia, our silver supporters, Adobe and Siteimprove, and our bronze supporters, Samsung Internet, DQ Systems, and the Paciello Group. And it is captioned by MyClearText. Inclusive Design 24 will be back on the hour with Sven Genzer, who will be talking about how to drive web accessibility in a big organization. Join us then.